Some moments in this work find you quietly, not with sirens or urgency, but with a stillness that stops you cold. She would later struggle to explain exactly what it was that made her slow the patrol vehicle that morning, on a stretch of road she had driven 100 times before. But something did, and that something changed her. The morning had settled into that familiar, unhurried rhythm that rural patrol routes often carry in the early hours, the kind where the world hasn't fully woken yet, and the only sounds are gravel under tires and the low hum of the engine. Officer Dana Kellerman had been on shift since before sunrise. The radio was quiet. The landscape along the county's eastern corridor was what it always was, open stretches of scrubland giving way to patches of pine, the occasional farmhouse set far back from the road, and the long flat horizon that made distance feel honest out here. There was nothing unusual about any of it. Not yet. She noticed the movement first at the edge of her peripheral vision, a small disturbance in the tall grass that lined the right shoulder of the road. She eased off the accelerator without thinking, the way experienced officers often do when something registers before the mind catches up. Whatever it was small, low to the ground, and it had gone still the moment her vehicle slowed. She pulled to the shoulder and cut the engine. When she stepped out, the air had that cool, particular quality that early spring mornings carry in this part of the country. Damp earth, pine resin, and the faint mineral smell of recent rain. She stood for a moment, scanning the grass line. Nothing moved. A passing car might not have stopped at all. Most people wouldn't have, but Dana had learned, across years of this work, to trust the pause, to let silence do its job before she moved into it. Then she saw it. Sitting perfectly still at the edge of the grass, half hidden in the shadow of a low cedar branch, was a bobcat kitten. Not a cub in the soft, rounded sense of the word. This animal was past that stage, maybe 4 or 5 months old, with the lean, angular build that comes when wild things begin to grow into what they'll eventually become. Its tufted ears were upright and alert. Its eyes, wide, amber, impossibly focused, were fixed directly on her. It did not run, it did not crouch into a defensive posture or hiss or retreat into the brush the way every instinct it possessed should have demanded. It simply sat, and it watched her. Dana went still. In her years working alongside wildlife response teams and state conservation officers, she had learned enough to know that a wild bobcat, even a young one, does not behave this way. They are not curious about humans in the way that invites proximity. They are secretive animals, built by instinct for avoidance. A healthy bobcat kitten, startled near a road, should have been gone before she had even opened her door. The fact that this one had not moved, had not even flinched, was not endearing. It was a signal. Something was wrong. She took a slow step forward, keeping her movements deliberate and low, her hands visible at her sides. The kitten watched. 1 step, 2. She stopped at roughly 15 feet and crouched down, bringing herself closer to eye level. The animal's gaze did not waver. And then, in a motion so quiet and precise that it almost didn't seem real, the kitten stood, turned away from her, and began walking slowly into the brush. It stopped after 4 or 5 steps. It turned and looked directly back at her. Then it waited. Dana felt the hair on her arms rise beneath her jacket, not from fear, from recognition. She had seen this behavior described once, in a wildlife rehabilitation context, by a biologist who had spent 30 years working with injured and orphaned animals across the Southeast. He had called it redirected distress behavior, an observable, if rare, pattern in certain young animals who, in the absence of adult guidance, transfer their need for help onto the nearest available presence. In the field, it looks exactly like what it sounds like. It looks like asking. She looked back toward the road. Her vehicle sat idling softly on the shoulder. The radio was quiet. The morning was still. She looked back at the kitten. It hadn't moved. It was still watching her, patient in the way that only animals can be patient, without doubt, without second-guessing, without the complicated calculations that crowd human decisions. It had made its choice. It was simply waiting to see if she would make hers. Dana Kellerman had responded to hundreds of calls in her career. She had pulled people from wreckage, talked strangers back from ledges, sat with grief-stricken families in fluorescent-lit hospital hallways at 2 in the morning. She knew what it felt like when something needed her. She knew it the way you know a smell, or a sound, not in your head but somewhere older than that. She took a breath, and she followed. She had no protocol for this. There was no training module, no field manual, no radio code for following a bobcat kitten into the brush because something in your gut told you that you had to. And yet her boots were already moving, slowly, carefully, through the low scrub and scattered pine needles, keeping the small animal just within sight. The kitten moved at a pace that felt almost considered, not frantic, not playful. There was no randomness to it. Every few steps it would pause, turn its amber eyes back toward her, confirm she was still there, and continue. It was the most deliberate thing she had ever witnessed in a wild animal. Dana kept her breathing steady. She was aware of the branches catching at her jacket, the soft give of the earth beneath her boots, the way the tree line thickened slightly as they moved further from the road. She noted her surroundings the way her training had taught her, not with anxiety, but with attention. The kitten stayed low, threading between patches of tall grass and exposed root systems with a familiarity that told her this was not unfamiliar ground. It knew where it was going. That realization settled over her quietly. This animal wasn't wandering. It wasn't spooked and circling in confusion. It had a destination, and somehow, in whatever way instinct and desperation intersect in a young wild creature, it had decided that she was the one to bring there. The sounds changed as they moved deeper, the distant murmur of road traffic fading, replaced by the dry rustle of wind through pine crowns and the occasional sharp call of a bird somewhere above. It felt removed from everything, private, the kind of quiet that amplifies small things, the snap of a twig underfoot, the kitten's soft, almost inaudible exhale each time it paused to look back at her. Dana slowed. Her instincts, the ones honed not in classrooms but in years of showing up to places where something had already gone terribly wrong, were fully awake now. The kitten had stopped ahead of her, maybe 20 feet out. It didn't look back this time. It sat down in the grass, facing away from her, and let out a sound so small and so raw that it stopped Dana completely. Not a hiss, not a growl, a cry. The kind of sound that doesn't need translation, across species, across instinct, across everything that separates a human woman from a wild animal in a quiet stretch of southern woodland. It was grief and urgency compressed into a single heartbreaking note. Dana pushed forward through the last of the brush, and then she saw it. She almost didn't register what she was seeing at first. The shape was partially concealed by a fall of dried brush and the shadow of a leaning pine, the kind of natural cover that in any other moment she might have walked right past. But the kitten had sat down directly beside it, pressing its small body flush against the larger form with a stillness that was almost ceremonial, protective, like it had been there before, like it had been waiting beside this spot for longer than anyone would want to imagine. Dana stepped closer. It was an adult female bobcat, stretched on her side in the flattened grass, her breathing shallow and irregular, the kind of breathing that has a sound to it, a labored, papery quality that Dana recognized immediately. She had heard it before, in other contexts, in other places. It was the sound of a body working harder than it should have to stay present. The cat's eyes were half open, glazed with the particular vacancy of an animal deep in shock. There were no obvious wounds visible from where Dana stood, but the stillness of the animal's hindquarters, the unnatural angle of one rear leg, told a story that didn't need close examination to understand. She had been hit, most likely on the road, and she had managed, somehow on pure biological will, to drag herself into the brush before she could go no further. Dana's throat tightened. The kitten pressed closer against its mother and let out another one of those small, fractured cries. The adult cat's ear moved, barely, just a faint swivel toward the sound, and then went still again. It was the most devastating thing Dana had witnessed in a long time, not because it was dramatic, because it wasn't. It was quiet, and close, and unbearably real. A mother who had used the last of her strength to get away from the road. A kitten who had refused to leave her side. And then, when the kitten had finally understood that staying wasn't enough, it had gone looking for the only thing it could think of: help. Dana crouched down slowly, her hand moving to her radio with the practiced steadiness of someone who knows that falling apart is a luxury saved for later. She pressed the call button, kept her voice level, gave her location, described what she had, requested wildlife emergency response. The words came out clean and procedural, exactly as they were supposed to, but her eyes never left the kitten. It had turned to look at her, fully, directly, the way it had on the roadside. Except now there was something different in its expression. The urgency had quieted. It had done what it set out to do. It had found someone, and now it was trusting her to do the rest. They arrived within 20 minutes, a wildlife rehabilitator and 2 conservation officers, moving quickly but calmly through the brush with a transport crate and a soft trauma kit. Dana had stayed exactly where she was, crouched a few feet from the injured bobcat, close enough to monitor her breathing, far enough to avoid adding unnecessary stress to an animal already carrying more than she could bear. The kitten had not moved from its mother's side the entire time. Not once. The rehabilitator, a woman named Carol who had been doing this work for over 2 decades, took one look at the adult bobcat and gave Dana a single, measured nod. She had seen enough to know what they were dealing with. Blunt force trauma, internal injuries likely. The rear leg almost certainly fractured, but the cat was still breathing, still here. And in this line of work, still here means something. They worked with the kind of quiet efficiency that comes from long experience. Voices low, movement slow and deliberate, every action designed to keep the animal's stress response from compounding the damage already done. The kitten retreated a few feet during the transfer, watching from the grass with wide, unblinking eyes, but it didn't flee. It stayed within sight of its mother until the crate was secured and Carol had confirmed they were ready to move. Dana stood, and that was when it hit her. Not all at once, more like a slow pressure that had been building since the moment she first stepped out of her vehicle that morning, finally reaching the point where it had nowhere left to go. She watched the transport crate being carefully carried back through the brush toward the road, and she thought about the kitten standing alone at the roadside. She thought about the way it had turned and looked back at her. The trust in that gesture, uncomplicated, unguarded, and offered to a species that wild things have every reason to fear. It had chosen her. Out of instinct and desperation and whatever quiet intelligence lives inside animals that we don't yet have the language to fully describe, it had walked toward her instead of away. It had led her through the brush to the one thing in its small world that mattered most. And somehow, against the kind of odds that don't always resolve this way, it had been enough. Dana pressed the back of her hand briefly against her mouth, took a breath, let it out slowly. The kitten emerged from the grass and stood at the edge of the clearing, watching the crate, watching its mother, watching Dana. Then it sat down, calm, waiting, still trusting. She looked at it for a long moment. Sometimes this work strips everything down to something simple and irreducible, a reminder of why any of it matters in the first place. Not the paperwork or the protocols or the long quiet hours on empty roads, but this, a small animal that had nothing left but hope, and somehow knew exactly where to bring it. She wiped her eyes, and she didn't apologize for it.